not still tight. Oh, there it goes. Sweet. That worked out perfectly. And now to do the rest. Alright, so that's all of the exhaust studs pulled off without breaking a single one, so that's great. So here it is, all of them off. Now as you can see, I started masking the block off to paint the block. Obviously this will work better if you disassemble everything, but since I'm not taking off the timing belt and stuff, I'm just gonna mask everything off and spray around it carefully. Now I've already started on this side, so now let's start spraying on this side. Well, I'd say that turned out pretty good. So I didn't get very much overspray at all. Let's take a look on the other side. Same thing over here, not much overspray at all. Now for the paint that I use, I just use this stuff, VHT engine enamel, and this is satin black. This is the same paint that I use on basically all of my engine stuff. Okay, so the new exhaust studs are on, also the new exhaust manifold gasket. So now next thing I'm going to do is put on this coolant pipe. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky because you got to put this hose from hell on at the same time with the pipe. So first thing I was going to do is put the hose on there, throw this pipe on, and then connect it on here and then bolt everything down. And there you go, we got the two coolant hoses on along with the whole coolant pipe. So now we're actually ready to throw the turbo onto the engine. Now before you throw the turbo on the engine, there's two gaskets here that should be replaced. So one here, and then one there, and actually there's going to be one more right over here. So just make sure that's all done before you even try to put this thing on. Okay, here's an easy one. Now this is the thermostat and the housing. I painted it silver real quick. Now the only thing you gotta really worry about is lining up that jiggle pin right there with the arrow. Because if you don't, then it's gonna be really hard to bleed the coolant. So let's put this thing on, and then exhaust side is pretty much all done. So that pretty much finishes up the exhaust side. So now I am ready to move on to the intake side, and I will be starting out with this fuel rail. So the fuel rail is pretty dirty. Just going to give that a good scrubbing. And then for the injectors, going to be replacing all the seals on it as well. So there's only two on there. It's going to be this little O-ring here, and then a little these things that goes right here. So here is the old one, very hard, cracked. New one, nice and soft. Okay, now that's the fuel rail all cleaned up with new seals. Now let's move back to the exhaust side. So the alternator, so in an AW11, you kind of have to run the alternator up on the exhaust side because if you put it down here, just like an AW20 has it, you will hit the subframe. You could probably hammer it out, but there's barely any room there. So you kind of have to run it up here. But then there's also another little problem with that, is how are you going to route the belt? So normally there's an AC compressor right here with a tensioner, but a lot of guys, they never run the AC compressor, so it's just dead weight sitting there. So I think I've come up with a pretty neat little solution. And here's all the parts. So what I'm going to be using is, this is a Datsun 280Z alternator tensioner bracket. It kind of works just by, it's like a tie rod, I guess. It just spins, easily adjustable. And then here's all the little bolts. So I'm gonna show you guys with it mocked up real quick. I forgot to show the part number for the belt, but here it is. That's the part number. This is actually a belt from a 2007 Toyota Camry hybrid with the 4-cylinder. Alright, so here's everything kind of mocked up. I know the belt looks kind of long, but this is the exact same setup that I used on my old Gen 4 swapped AW11, and it worked great. So here's the tensioner bracket. It already threads into the existing hole right there, and then the other side just goes onto the bottom of the alternator. Now you do have to run a spacer right here. I got the spacer just ready to go from Ace Hardware, and then yeah, that's pretty much it. Easily adjustable. So that's loosening it. That's tightening it. This will give me plenty of tension. So with that done, this part right here is actually useless. So I'm going to cut that out. This is the alternator bracket, and then that's where the old bolt would go. So this would have went right here. So I'm just going to cut this off, paint it real quick, and then that'll be alternator all done. And that's the bottom piece cut out of the alternator bracket, and it's also painted. So now let's put everything together, and there you go. All the alternator stuff is on, and the belt is nicely tensioned, and there's still plenty of room to be able to adjust the belt if I ever need to. So that finishes up the exhaust side. So now let's get back to the intake side. The only thing I've done so far is put on the fuel rail. So the next big thing would obviously be the intake manifold. Now I still gotta paint this, but I actually want to grind this cast mark away, because it kind of just sits on top. Doesn't look the best. So I'm going to grind that away, repaint it. I'm just going to use this thing right here. Now here's the intake manifold all done. So I cleaned it all up, painted it, and I grinded off this crease. Not crease, more of a casting mark up here. Now I use wrinkle paint to kind of imitate the texture of the OEM manifold, so it looks kind of like it's cast all the way. Then it's sprayed on top silver, and this is the paint that I used. VHT engine enamel, universal aluminum. Yeah, so I didn't want to grind down a manifold here at home just because it makes such a huge mess, and that's why I didn't get any footage of me doing that, but it's really easy and straightforward. Just grind it down till it's smooth, and then I use wrinkle paint on the bottom of this, and then silver paint on top. And I say it looks pretty good. You can't really tell if there's like ever anything there. So anyways, manifold's done. Now there's just a few more parts left to the engine assembly. So I got spark plugs still, and then the valve cover. I've already got new gaskets on there, and also a new PCV. So when I was disassembling this engine, there was kind of RTV all over the valve cover. So I've got that all cleaned up now. And the only spots that you need RTV would be in this corner, in these two corners, then up here, and then also on this half moon. That's it. You don't need to put it anywhere else. Okay, valve cover is done. So now pretty much the last part to the engine would be the intake manifold. I've already got a new gasket on there, so let's throw on the intake. There we go, intake manifold is on. Pretty much a fully assembled engine now. I really do like how this turned out. Looks nice and clean. So I've also replaced the fuel return line and then the vacuum hoses as well. I also bolted on the axle carrier bearing. Now you don't need this unless you only need this if you're using an E153 transmission. If you're using S54, then you don't need it. But as I said before, I am using an E153. So I was going to finish this up, but I don't actually have the gaskets for it. So I'm missing the gasket that goes in between here, and then the one that goes here. So I've got that on order. I'll finish that off camera, and I'm also going to be replacing these hoses as well. Now one reason why I went with the Racer X coolant neck is because so it has this part, which is OEM, but it also has another hole over here for external water temperature gauge, which is what I want to run because I want to know if this thing's overheating or not. I can't trust OEM gauges. Now, I'm also going to be changing out this oil pressure sensor. This will work fine on SW20s because this just tells you that the oil pressure is low, so a light will turn on. But on an AW11, there's actually a needle that points where your oil pressure is. So I got this Racer X part. Then I also got the OEM 4AGE oil pressure sensor. It's a lot bigger than I thought, but this will read correctly for the AW11 gauge cluster. And also this other hole, just like with this over here, I can put on an external gauge so that I know exactly where my oil pressure is and also my coolant temperature. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the reassembly of the 3SGT engine. So I've got it angled just about where it would sit in the MR2 engine bay. So it does sit at an angle like this. And just looking at it from here, I'd say it's going to look pretty good inside the AW11. Man, look at all these new parts. It's not the cleanest engine, but it's at least way better than when I got it. So, yeah, I guess the next part for the MR2 build will be painting the engine bay. So, I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.